Bore da a chroeso cynnes I webinar Fforwm Seilwaith Werth Cymru. Back in the 1970s, one of my predecessors in the old Nature Conservancy Council nearly got fired for commissioning a report into the wildlife of Birmingham, the backcountry, because back then everybody knew that there was no nature in towns and cities. Well, since then, I've seen herds of zebra in the Kenneth Steinbank Nature Reserve in the middle of Durban, and closer to home, the small-flowered tongue orchid spontaneously appeared on the green roof of the Namura Bank in the City of London. Well, we all know that urban areas host incredible biodiversity. So maybe it's time to think differently and contemplate allowing natural processes to play a bigger part in our climate challenge cities. Dr Nathalie Pettorelli led a team who did think the unthinkable and concluded that urban rewilding has great potential to benefit people as well as nature. And we're really fortunate to have Nathalie here today to tell us about her team's work. Before I hand over to Nathalie, here's how today's webinar will work. Nathalie will present for 20 minutes, and while she's speaking, please keep your microphones on mute, or every time the dog next door barks, Nathalie's audio is going to drop out. While Nathalie is presenting, please post your questions to her in the chat. And if you do have any problems with the technology, please post those in the chat too, so I can try to resolve them. We'll have the chance for an in-depth conversation with Nathalie after her presentation. I'll go through the questions in the chat in order and ask you to turn on your camera and microphone to ask your questions to Nathalie directly. That will spark off more questions, so please use Zoom's virtual hand-raising function to let me know you have a question, and I'll come round to you in order to ask Nathalie your question. If you're cut off for any reason during the webinar, please close and restart Zoom, then use the original link in your email to reconnect. After 40 minutes, Zoom will automatically end our webinar. However, if discussions are still going strong, we can extend our time until 11 o'clock when I promised that I'd release Nathalie. To continue the extended discussion, please close and restart Zoom, then use the original link in your email to reconnect. As always, I'll record both the webinar and the discussion and post them to our Green Infrastructure Forum YouTube channel, so you or anyone with an interest can watch them again. So if no one has any questions about how the webinar will work, I'd like to hand you over to Dr. Nathalie Pettorelli from the Zoological Society of London. Nathalie, over to you.
Thank you so much, Pete. Let me try to share my, I will need to share my screen. Can I share my screen, Pete?
Yes, you should be able to now.
So I'll do this, and then this. Hopefully you're seeing a presentation. Can someone tell me yes?
That's perfect. Thank you very much.
You're most welcome. So thank you for having me at this event and talk to you about the report we've wrote and that was published in September on rewilding cities. So the context under which we decided to write this report is that we are a conservation charity working on trying to protect and recover nature. And right now, this is a challenging job because we are facing a number of environmental crises. A climate change one, which I'm sure you're aware of, with our greenhouse gas emission changing drastically patterns in our climate, having an impact on extreme natural events, on glacier retreat, on sea level. And then at the same time, we are facing a biodiversity crisis. So we are losing nature very, very rapidly, much more rapidly than ever before. And the UK is particularly bad at retaining its wildlife. To give you an idea, it has been estimated that the UK has lost around half of the biodiversity it used to have. So the problem that we are having is that those two big crises are actually intertwined. So we know that climate change is impacting wildlife, so changing the habitat, changing the reproduction pattern, changing the food availability, and this all has an impact on extinction risk. But at the same time, the loss of nature is also deepening the climate change crisis. And that's because nature is really good at capturing and storing carbon. And so the more you remove nature, the less nature is helping us removing that carbon and trying to stabilize our climate. And this is not just about carbon sequestration and storage. It's also the fact that nature can help us adapt to those new climatic conditions that we are experiencing. So the conclusion here is that in nature, and not just trees, because generally people think that it's only trees that matter. Nature as a whole is central to tackling climate change, but it's also central to sustainable development, human health and well-being. So nature recovery is really a big priority. And this is why, for example, the UN has declared this decade the decade of nature restoration. Now, how do you actually recover nature? What can you do? One thing that you can do is to protect the land that still has a lot of nature. So setting up protected area, for example. You can increase the environmental standards and the law. This is quite topical in the UK when you think about water quality and all the waste released in rivers. But basically, stronger environmental standards and laws help retain nature. You can go for traditional restoration, so taking degraded area and try to bring them back to what they used to be. And you can also, more and more people are thinking about rewilding. Now, you might wonder what's rewilding, and that would be a fair question because the term is being used in all kinds of settings, so much so that the scientific community had to come together under an IUCN, so that's the International Union for Nature Conservation umbrella, to try to agree on what is rewilding. But basically, it's a rapidly developing concept in ecosystem management, which started in the 80s in the US, where a bunch of conservation biologists started to think about what they call the 3 Cs, cores, carnivores, and corridors. So trying to protect and maintain those big area with full food webs that would be connected by those corridors. But that term, that concept of rewilding has mutated quite rapidly and has evolved, and currently is much more understood as a conservation approach that support the reinstatement, so the recovery of natural processes in functionally degraded ecosystems. So ecosystems that do not work the way they should. So they are less, their functioning is not as it should be. And the idea is to put them on a trajectory to being more ecologically complex, so more diversity, more species, more interaction, and less subjected to human intervention. So something where a human control is minimal to none in the long term. If you want to understand the difference between restoration and rewilding, there's a number of characteristics that help you see where those two concepts are roughly found. So the relevance to historical benchmark, which means whether you're trying to recreate what was there before or not, is much more higher in restoration than in rewilding. The fidelity to taxonomic precedent, that means the way, whether you're trying to get the same species as they were before or not, is also higher in restoration and rewilding. In rewilding, basically, what you want is to have species that help the ecosystem work better. You're not that bothered whether they were there before or not. The predictability of the system, so to which extent you know how that ecosystem will work, is higher in restoration because it has a higher level commitment to management over time, but it's therefore lower in rewilding. So in rewilding, you can see system-driven changes in composition or functioning. That you may not see those sharp transition when you're working in restoration, where you're always trying to stay at some kind of statical ideal type of state. Why you translocate is also quite different. So translocate means moving species from one place to another. In restoration, you're really moving them to try to restore the composition that was there before. So you knew that this species and that species were there, that species is missing, you're bringing it back. In rewilding, you don't care that much whether it was there or not, but what you're trying what you're caring for is whether that species was playing an important role, and the disappearance of it made the functioning of the ecosystem altered. So you're trying to bring that functioning back. The taxonomic substitutions, it's the way you're using one species over another because, for example, that species is extinct, is much more resisted in restoration than in rewilding. And therefore the emergence of novel ecosystems, so organization of nature in a way that we haven't seen before, is probably more accepted in rewilding than in restoration. And of course, because the commitment to management is higher in restoration, the cost per hectare of those approaches tends to be higher in restoration than in rewilding. So it's because rewilding has long been associated with large herbivore and carnivore and big area and cores in the 3C. There's been quite some hesitation and reluctance to really talk about rewilding in cities. And especially because the rewilding concept has the word wild, and that is quite a word that can trigger a lot of conflict, but tends to be associated with those large remote places without people. So the conceptualization of cities as urban ecosystem on top of it is also quite new. So for a long time, cities were seen as not part of nature. They were seen as so degraded that it was a human space and therefore not a nature space. And so in nature conservation for a long time, there was very little interest in the conservation of urban ecosystem or just to talk about urban ecosystem. However, things have changed recently, and there's been an acknowledgement, and COVID pandemic has played a role in this. There's been an acknowledgement that actually cities host a lot of wildlife, which people have probably more discovered as they were locked down and only limited to exploring their nearer environment. Realizing that it's richer, it can be richer in plant species and other species, more rich than other rural places, and so sometimes actually harboring a species that are of conservation relevance nationally. So quite unique species, which are, for example, found in various cities in the UK, such as in London. So if we talk about London, for example, this is not a small space. It's nearly 1,600 square kilometers, which is roughly slightly more than the size, slightly more than half of the size of Luxembourg. In London, around 24% of it, which is around 380 square kilometers, is actually private gardens. And again, for comparison, if you think about the New Forest National Park, and that's 570. So again, more or less, slightly more than half of that national park is areas where you can potentially have nature in private gardens in London. And 57% of those private gardens is vegetated cover. Now, this proportion is actually going down as we see people going for plastic turf or reducing the amount of vegetation in their garden for convenience, among other things. Now, those gardens are actually quite important. They can be a home to a range of plants and animals. And in London, you can find bombardier beetle, black red start, stag beetles, which are nationally rare, or broad-banded carder and St. Martin. So those gardens are actually really important for species that are not doing so well outside of London. So how do we articulate the rewilding idea with cities? Now, if you accept that rewilding is about moving ecosystem on a continuum of human modification, so basically moving them from a state from where they are to a state of increased ecological complexity and reduce human control, then you can apply the concept of rewilding to any kind of ecosystem, and that includes urban ecosystem. By doing so, what you're basically saying is that you can deploy a number of strategies that can help those urban ecosystems recover ecological processes interaction, which include trophic interaction. But then you can also boost a number of ecosystem function, which we're going to discuss later on, because those ecosystem functioning is what underpins how nature can help us adapt to climate change, for example, and increase the overall resilience of the ecosystem. So basically increase the likelihood that your urban ecosystem is going to do well when it is faced with a number of climatic shock, for example. So what would be the benefits of urban rewilding? So how could people benefit from putting less control of nature and letting it coexist with us in cities? The big one is climate change mitigation and adaptation, but it also matters when it comes to reducing pollution, wildlife recovery, reducing environmental management costs, which will be quite important in a cost of living crisis, as well as improving human health and well-being and economic activity and wealth. If we focus on climate change, particularly how rewilding can help with extreme climatic event. If you think about nature recovery in cities, well, first, it can increase the rate of water infiltration, as well as slowing water flow and reducing the risk of riverbank collapse and erosion, which is really quite interesting when you know that countries such as the UK are likely to experience more flooding. It can also help cool cities and reduce that urban heat island effect, as well as reducing the impact of air pollution, which can be particularly bad during heat waves. Again, very interesting stuff to have when you know that, as we have experienced this summer, the heat waves are coming, and they are coming more frequently and more strongly. And then it can promote, because you're doing much less and you're not having so much control on what's getting established, what kind of nature you get into your cities. You're basically promoting the establishment of species that are toughies, that are really strong and good at and resilient at coping with rapid changes, including drought and heat waves. And so therefore you're increasing the resilience of your ecosystem as a whole. You're also helping the establishment of ecosystem engineers, which are those species that tend to change their environment, and the change that they do matters for other species. And this can be really interesting because they might create microhabitat that can help other species go through heat waves and drought in a better way. And then it can mitigate the facilitating effect of all those extreme natural events on infectious disease threat to public health, which is also a concern, because as our climate is changing, we are going to see more host and most vector and more disease coming in countries such as the UK. The contribution to wildlife recovery is relatively straightforward. Urban rewilding can really help slow species loss and support wildlife recovery by basically increasing habitat availability and also connectivity. And urban ecosystem connectivity is key. This ability to move within the bigger area is really what supports wildlife in cities. And that could facilitate the return of certain species and support the natural colonization of those cities by new species, as well as improving the viability of existing population of species. And one species, two or three species actually, we discuss a lot in the report, are hedgehogs, which are typical city dwellers and are really, for them, the connectivity within a urban landscape is really key for their viability. Or we discuss also the otters, which are coming back in a number of cities in the UK. Now, the urban rewilding, like any kind of environmental approach, is associated with a number of challenges. This might be the spread of invasive alien species, the species introduction by the public, the problem of disease, as we've discussed before, the fact that rewilding could create an enthusiasm that would eventually lead to divesting resources from existing traditional conservation side, the problem of human-wildlife conflict. We are living in countries such as the UK where people are not actually used to live with wildlife, so how to get that going is going to be tricky. The problem of green gentrification, the attitude to urban green space, lack of monitoring, because people think that rewilding means no human intervention, therefore no monitoring, which is absolutely not the case. It's not because you don't decide not to do something that you don't monitor what's going on, as well as the issues around challenging policy context and complex legal and financing structure. So if we delve into some example to see a bit how those challenges get articulated, one of the countries that has been starting to dive into rewilding is Germany. And there is this really nice example in East Germany of a rewilding project where basically negative perception created quite a number of issues for the long-term longevity of that project. Basically, this was an area that used to have people, and then people abandon it, but some people stay. And what happened is that some conservation group started to want to rewild it. But the problem is that they didn't really communicate that very well with the people around. And so what the local residents perceived is abandonment rather than revitalization. And therefore they started to not value the area at all. And so what you could see was rubbish left in rewilded area, people talking quite negatively about the area. And so really very few people actually saw this as desirable spaces. So what happened is that the conservation groups turned this thing upside down, started to really engage with people, talking about the benefit, explaining what was happening and how this was benefiting people, documenting the return of wildlife and talking to people about what was happening. And this has really helped improve the perception of what was happening and the local engagement and therefore local support and long-term sustainability. Now, where would you do rewilding if you were to think about rewilding spaces in cities? And again, it's really important to understand that in cities, it's not about one space that you rewild and this is where everything will happen. It's much more about a patch of rewilding sites that can get connected and therefore favor the movement of species and the viability of those populations. Well, of course, one thing that we could look at is improving the proportion of vegetated private spaces. So whether it's gardens, but also any kind of areas and parks and gardens where people that people use and that could be rewilded. There's also some potential around railways and abandoned tracks in particular, as well as anything that has to do with rivers, wetlands, and estuaries. Again, another example of how this works in practice. So this is an example of a rewilding area in Singapore. So this is a river, a part of a river that was restored as part or rewilded as a part of Singapore's Active, Beautiful and Clean Waters program, which really focused on renaturalizing and reinstating natural processes in waterways to aid flood management and create new spaces for people. And so what they did was the channel, the original river had been straightened for water flow at that point, but that was creating a bunch of problems. So what they did was to unstraighten and widen that river to slow down the water flow and then start to create habitat for a number of freshwater species. And by that, they use a number of hands-on approaches, so really a hard and soft engineering technique, and in particular to stabilize those new riverbanks. And then they reconnected it to a floodplain to allow the excess water during a rainstorm to drain away, and therefore restoring a key function. And that area started to be really valued by people. But because of the function that it was delivering in terms of water management, but also in terms of well-being and health, with the accessibility to the park being really put at the center of the project. So this illustrates some of the key steps that might need to be put in place to really support urban rewilding project implementation. So as we have already discussed, this adoption of a landscape view, so understanding that It's not rewilding one garden and thinking that this will work. Of course, rewilding one garden will not suddenly completely change the urban ecosystem. It's understanding that a city is a urban ecosystem, and every time you rewild a garden or a green patch, you're improving the landscape connectivity, which ultimately matter for all those population of species that live with us in city. It's also about understanding the local policy context and setting up sustainable financing arrangement. This takes time. So there are things you cannot do under the law, depending on where you work and where you are, sorry, and what laws are in place. Of course, as we have seen with the German example, really getting people on board from the start and getting them on board to help design what's the vision and how you're going to go there, admitting that those vision can change over time. So, but co-creating a project and going on with an evolving vision that starts where people are ready to go is really important. Learning from existing project and getting the monitoring right. Monitoring is key because that's what's going to get you to pick up problems before they become huge, and really do some adaptive management to manage them, as well as building partnerships. So especially between different cities, for example, that might engage in rewilding. There's a lot of things to gain by going together on a project like this. A quick note on that policy context and financing. So as I was saying, it's really important before doing anything to understand what can and cannot be done. And that can be shaped by local policy context, environmental, biodiversity, land use, and agricultural policy. And these can vary quite often, quite a lot between countries and regions. There's also the problem of funding, because it's important to go with the long-term view in this, and securing the funding with rewilding project is difficult because you don't know, because it's an open-ended project in a way, because there's no state to be reached. What you're looking at is an functioning ecosystem. It doesn't matter what kind of ecosystem or how it looks like. It's the point is that it works and that it's dynamic, which means that it's much more difficult to build up a financing model that is well, it's different from the current financing models that focus very much on the state. And then it's important to really factor cost, all cost. So of course, the cost for action to kickstart the ecological rewiring process. So as you've seen with the Singapore example, there was a lot of engineering work going on that can cost a lot of money, and that needs to be secured early on. But it's also very important to secure the money for public engagement and for the monitoring, which tends to be generally forgotten. So if I have three conclusions, and the three conclusions that we put in the report are like this. The first one is that nature matters really everywhere. And we can't continue to pretend that some nature are more worth than others. It's the urban nature in particular is in dire need of visibility, as well as support and as well as respect. And that's because it's really supporting more than half of the human population in the world. More than half of us are living in cities. In the UK is over 85%. And we know how wildlife does matter for health and well-being. So it's really important that we start to take that seriously. What's interesting with urban rewilding is that it might not save all the zebra and rhino of this world, but it provides a platform for engaging people with nature conservation, and give them a platform to also enter to have a deep dive into what it takes to recover nature, how those decisions are made, and be part of the efforts, basically. And the second important point is that rewilding is one option in a big toolbox. So this is not about saying that we should just rewild everywhere and just do rewilding. There's a number of things that needs to happen. There's the rewilding is not better than or worse than other stuff. It's one possibility if the context is right and if people are ready for it. And so what you don't want is to start to divest money from things that are working to something that looks appealing or but not at all feasible for that area. It's also important to understand that nature recovery only works if you stop and if you reduce and stop practices that are actually killing nature, so, or substantially and negatively impacting biodiversity, such as the use of pesticide or the replacement of vegetated cover with artificial loam. So on top of rewilding, we also need stronger legislation to counter those activities. And then the last point is that every city, every place is unique, and therefore what may work in one city may not work in another. And there are some really good initiatives such as the IUCN Urban Alliance and the Urban Biodiversity Hub that really provide those important platforms, those hubs for promoting knowledge exchange and collaboration, but also between urban rewilding project and other approaches to nature recovery in cities, such as restoration. And that's it. I hope this was clear enough. Thank you.
Wow. And thank you so much for that amazing presentation, Nathalie. We've already kicked off quite a lot of questions in the chat. And I wonder if we can start with Tom Johnson. Tom, can I ask you to turn your camera and microphone on and ask your question to Nathalie? Feel free to paraphrase it if you wish.
Morning, Pete. Thank you very much. And yeah, very succinctly put. Wow, incredible presentation. As you were talking, you got me thinking about the, I don't know if you're aware of it, the Map of Dreams out in East Anglia, where all sorts of different landowners and land managers are able to commit their land for, and I'm not sure if it's specifically rewilding, but some level of nature recovery. And it was originally done to try and get really large landowners to commit land. But what happened was local people picked up on it and went, oh, actually, I'm going to commit the bottom of my garden to it. And it just got me wondering whether some combination of the work that you're doing and that could actually be the key to unlock massive progress on Wales's 30 by 30 ambitions.
I think you're touching on something quite important. Yeah, it's this for urban ecosystem. This is all about connectivity. So it's about trying to get people to work together to improve those corridors and those connections. And how you do that, if you do that successfully, then you increase the chance of having more wildlife and more functioning ecosystem. Now, I know of a project in London that is called Rewild My Street. Which is slowly going into that direction of trying to equip people where if you want to do that, here are a bunch of stuff that you can do and this is how it goes and stuff. I don't know of any platform that would kind of bring people together, but that locally that could work and be quite efficient. What's interesting with rewilding is that it goes beyond natural sciences. So as you've seen, my talk is very much seen from a conservation biologist type of view, but the same type of discussion are happening among architects and land planners. So I think that there is enough interest from different communities to potentially get that working. But how you set up those connections and those networks of people locally that would buy in those kind of scheme is where the point about every city being different comes in. So it might be that one internet platform might work in one city while in other. If you go in big centers where people are using more open or more likely to go through non-technical solution, for example, so network of people talking, if that makes sense. But yes, the short answer is yes. If we can get driving engagement and citizen science into this, into a stuff where people come together and you equip them and support them, because I do think that it will need a bit of support, because there is a number of challenges associated with those approaches. So you need support to manage those challenges as they come. So they need to be rightly equipped and rightly funded.
Yeah, I mean, the point that really struck me was your comparison of the amount of gardens in London compared to the New Forest National Park. And, you know, when we're thinking about our 30 by 30 ambitions in Wales, that initially seems to be taking land out of farming for nature. And that's obviously hugely problematic. But I've got no idea how much land mass private gardens takes up in Wales. But I now need to do some GIS and find out.
I would just add that it's both, yeah. So it's not taking stuff from people; it's getting people to move together in a direction that supports everyone. And I don't think you can replace one or the other. I think but I think those kind of thinking spread the cost a bit more. So as of everybody is going to have to give in a bit, and that I think is an important point.
Thank you very much.
And that segues nicely into a little conversation that I was having in the chat with Chris Harris. in Wales, rewilding has had a bit of a bad press, maybe unfairly, because it's seen, rightly or wrongly, as excluding people from large chunks of the countryside. But I'm wondering whether rewilding in urban areas would actually be more acceptable in Wales. So Natalie, I wonder what you think about that.
I think that I'm very aware of the bad press in Wales as well as in other places, to be fair. I think it's because there's been, again, a lack of communication and also a lack of acknowledgement that those kind of, basically, there's been a lot of confusion as to what rewilding is. And that confusion hasn't been helped by the fact that there had been a number of media figures and big writers that have pushed ideas sometimes quite extremely. So I think the discussion about urban rewilding first help replace rewilding into what it actually is, not a land grabbing exercise that only focuses on big remote area and exclude people. But it's the fundamental of rewilding is really about less human control and more functioning. And that can happen everywhere, which is, I think, one of the strengths of that report, to replace that back into context and hopefully get people to understand that rewilding is not about no people. It's about making those ecosystems work better. And there's no indication that it can't work with people. So that, I think, is an interesting stuff. As of for the whether it could work in cities or not, this is something that I think will be highly variable depending on which cities you're looking at, because it depends on their history, their setting up, the way that those residents are used or not to coexist with some form of wildlife. I mean, what you see in cities in South America or in India is completely different from what you can see in London or in Edinburgh. So the level of biodiversity in the country to start with has a huge impact, and your culture and your belief in religion can have a huge impact too. And how you relate to nature is also quite important, but that can also vary from one city to the other in the UK. So I wouldn't say it has more chance to work. I think I think it has. It shouldn't be not explored, given the benefits that this could bring to people.